Hello Math 152 students. In this video, I want to make sure you know how to read and understand the rest of the examples in 10.2 and kind of what to focus on in regards to our previous example with StatCrunch and how your book handles some of this. So as a summary, following the last example, I want to go through this gray box and just point out our important steps. We talked about steps 1 through 5, and we also mentioned that you have to check your conditions. So you either want to check your conditions first, or sometimes I find it's easier after you've stated your null and alternative to do that. Step 2, make sure you know the level of significance, because this is going to dictate what you compare your p-value to. So we always compare our p-value to the level of significance to decide whether to reject or not reject the null hypothesis. Then the step 3, finding the test statistic or the p-value, can be achieved using StatCrunch. So your book does go through computing the test statistic by hand, the p-value by hand, but step 3 is our StatCrunch part. Jump straight to StatCrunch, generate your test statistic and p-value, then you're ready to jump to step 4. In the p-value approach, if your p-value is less than alpha, you reject the null. Anytime you reject the null hypothesis, you immediately accept the alternative. However, if your p-value is greater than alpha, you do not reject the null. Be careful that in your conclusions, not rejecting the null is not the same as accepting the null. Your 10.1 and 10.2 discusses this a little bit, but we're saying we can't rule out a conclusion, or we can't rule out a statement rather than we accept a statement. So let's take a look at what your book does in example 1. Notice you've got multiple videos. Make sure you're watching the StatCrunch example. Some of these have calculator versions. StatCrunch, I believe it's this middle one. And then they also do the by hand, which I don't recommend that you necessarily go through. So for example 1, you would want to make sure you read the setup. Ebook's a little slow. And then you do want to make sure you check your conditions. You do your step 1, your step 2, and then once you get down to step 3, where all of the work is, this is the part where you would go to StatCrunch, right? So kind of stop here, utilize StatCrunch, get your test statistic, which should match up with the negative 2.77 here, get your p-value, should match up with what they're doing here, and then you are ready to talk about your step 4, and then take a look at step 5. So again, for the other examples in this section, kind of a similar thing. You want to make sure you understand checking the conditions, step 1, step 2. Do your StatCrunch where they're doing their step 3. They also mention the technology approach. And then your p-value and test statistics should match up. Notice they put kind of a StatCrunch output. And then you should meet back up and verify your step 4 and step 5. All right, I just want to quickly make sure you pay attention to this second example in your textbook, the example 2, with step 4 and step 5. Your book goes to an example where your p-value is larger than your alpha, the reverse of what we saw in the example I went through, and you do not reject the null and how to state that. So make sure you're reading through that carefully. The last place I want to point you in your book is kind of some examples that we don't see as often. You can use confidence intervals to test a hypothesis if you have a two-tailed test. You don't see this as often. I like to think about confidence intervals as a complement to your hypothesis testing. You don't really have a lot of homework in chapter 10 that uses the confidence intervals, mainly because you can only use it in the two-tailed test. So you want to look through that example, and they just remind you about constructing a confidence interval and how to interpret that. Okay, the last thing I want to point you to is this third part about using the binomial distribution. Anytime your n times p times 1 minus p condition does not check, you run into some issues. With confidence intervals, if your n times p times 1 minus p did not check, it was a pretty much, we stop there, we can't continue. In the hypothesis testing event, we have some alternative methods. If our condition doesn't check here, we can't use the proportion procedure we were doing before with StatCrunch, but we can use the binomial. So this makes things a little bit more complicated, but you only run into it when your sample size is small and your conditions don't check. So what I would like for you to do in this case is read through this example 4, and your book goes through how to do it by hand and also discusses how to do the p-value in StatCrunch, which is the preferred method. So in this case, as you're reading through the step 3, they ordered the steps a little differently in this example, but when you're reading through the step 3, here is where you would want to go to StatCrunch and not necessarily the by hand. They mention StatCrunch, and they also give you an excellent video, I think it's the second one here, that uses StatCrunch with a small sample size. It refers you back to the binomial distribution that we saw in chapter 6 and gets your p-value or your probability from that distribution rather than your normal distribution. So again, this is the less likely scenario. I would recommend practicing with the other 2 examples in this section before you ever get here to be able to compare and contrast. Alright guys, so that's it for this video. You want to make sure you're going to your My Math Lab after this, doing lots of example problems, and send me questions as needed.